Airplane pilots of Reddit, what was your biggest we're all fricked up moment that you survived and your passengers didn't notice? My best friend's dad was a pilot for Western and Delta for a lot of years. He's always said that the most terrifying thing he experienced was flying into Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong. Due to the terrain and high rises at one end of the runway, you had a pretty sharp right turn on final approach and it took you close enough to the high rises that you could see TVs in the apartments. Once in 2013 my plane failed to start engine at the alternative airport, and I had to spend 2 more days in a poor hotel with all my 158 passengers waiting repair parts. I thought they would kill me every time I meet any one of them those days. I think this was my plane. Passenger here. There was once when I was little, we landed and the pilots told us to put down our window shades to keep the plane cool. They were pretty insistent. Being a kid, I kept it open a bit to peek out and saw after a little while that we were taxiing backwards. I don't know what happened, but I think they didn't want us to know they made a wrong turn or something. Oops. This is fairly common and it really is to keep the plane cool. The air conditioning system on the plane doesn't work as well on the ground as it does in flight, so on a warm sunny day the inside can get uncomfortably hot quickly. Obligatory not an airline pilot, but I am a private pilot and know a handful of airline pilots. Most of the things that make you feel like you're going to crash in a large jet turboprop are really not significant. Planes can handle way more turbulence than you fly through. That sound is probably normal, and the engine quitting doesn't mean you're going to fall out of the sky. Go-arounds, where the plane aborts its landing, happen a handful of times a day at most airports. It's nothing out of the ordinary. Flying on a US airline is one of the safest things you can do. You're more likely to die driving to the airport or even falling out of bed than you are in a large commercial airliner crash. Also, tarmac isn't any part of an airport, but rather a material that was used to make airport surfaces decades ago. Runway is where you land takeoff. Taxiway is where planes are moving and speaking with air traffic control. Ramp apron is where planes are parked and pushed back. I'm an air traffic controller, for the record. Had a pilot go Nordo, that's when, for whatever reason, they aren't on my frequency anymore. They didn't get the right one, misheard, or their radios crapped out. It happens fairly often, and there are a number of things we can do to get you back in the right place. This particular guy, however, went Nordo at precisely the worst time. He was going eastbound, which means he was at an odd altitude. He lost his radio, and his flight plan then had him turn southbound. That means he was supposed to be at an even altitude, which he obviously wasn't. There were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude, so he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet through all these people as I was descending and climbing them to get them out of his way. Then, apparently in an act of sheer ignorance on the pilot's part, he decided to choose an even altitude all by himself, knowing he should probably be at one. Remember all those planes I had to move out of his way? He managed to put himself right back into them. When you have closure rates of over 1000 knots, that's not a lot of time to react to those things. At the end, my butthole was clenched so tight that when I stood up, the seat came with me. Imagine after years of being a highly trained race car driver, you are now driving a Greyhound bus. Retired Air Force pilot. February 2017, flying American Airlines from Miami to Bam. We boarded the plane and noticed it was very hot. The air wasn't working. The attendant said it was, but the air blowing out of the vents was hot AF. Anyway, we were about 45 minutes out in the flight. We're all burning up and sweating our asses off. Pilot comes over the speaker, says that we are headed back to Miami and not to worry, but we've lost cabin pressure. Like I said, we were 45 minutes out from Miami, but it only took us like 20 minutes tops to get back to Miami. I knew crap was serious with the attendant was buckling herself in as soon as the pilot made the announcement. It was so hot and hard to breathe. What was even scarier is watching your plane pass the airport to fly over the ocean and dump fuel. I'm assuming that's just in case we land badly, less chance of exploding. When it came time to land, we were directed to a clear section of the airport. You could see emergency crews lining the tarmac like they were just waiting to recover bodies. It was the worst landing of my life. I swear to God, we came in so hot we were on 2 wheels for a few secs. A friend of mine on the trip with me had never flown before and was dang near in cardiac arrest. I was just dumbfounded any of this was happening. Anyway, they let us off directly on the tarmac as quickly as possibly. We had to wait 2 hours for a different plane. American Airlines offered us all free beer to make up for the scare though. Then we had to wait an additional hour because our stewardess had gotten so freaked out she grabbed her wheeled bag and went the frick home. Helicopter pilot here. I was flying a relatively short tour with 3 passengers in an R-44 over some vineyards near the airport I was flying out of. Passengers were all pretty cool and relaxed through the flight, so naturally I was as well. Person up front with me was very interested in what I was doing and how everything worked. He had a million questions and I was happy to answer them all. Anyways, tour is almost over and I'm on about 1/2 mile final when the clutch light turns on. For those not familiar, the clutch light on Robinson helicopters is pretty normal and comes on whenever the clutch is adjusting. Especially in colder climates, it is completely normal to come on for a few seconds and go away. No big deal. However, if it stays on for more than 10 seconds, we're potentially in big trouble. So the clutch light comes on while I'm mid-sentence and I subconsciously start counting. Somewhere around 7 I stop talking. Flip the pilot ISO, practically in denial that this is about to happen. I get to 10, pull the clutch circuit breaker. At the same time I felt just the slightest tail shudder, so I pushed for some extra airspeed and mentally prepared to do an auto power off landing. Luckily we made it to the ground fine and I never lost power. After I set it down, the person up front looked at me and said, "What was that all about?" So I just said, "I thought you guys would enjoy a little excitement at the end." They thought it was awesome, so I sent them on their merry way, none the wiser. After they walked away I opened it up to see only one of the 4 clutch belts still in place. Scariest day that those folks will never know they had. I wasn't the pilot in the story. I was the clueless passenger. My cousin was a pilot. Small craft like crop dusters and helicopters. He was probably a pretty competent pilot. Spent a lot of time flying bad forest fires, running power lines, flying geologists on erupting volcanoes, removing shot up soldiers from across enemy lines while being shot at, etc. One time he took me up in his crop duster. It was a little single-seater. I was sitting on the empty chemical tub behind his seat. We were flying over a little town, not sure how high, but not very high, perhaps a couple thousand feet. I was leaning way over trying to get a look out the window, when he started to look way left and way right, like he was trying to see the tail end of the plane. He was methodically checking various controls, and also appeared to be methodically messing with the little mechanical trim controls. Finally, he looked back along the inside of the cabin, just under the window, and when he got to where I was leaning out the window, he asked me to move away from the window a bit. After we landed, he pointed out the little rudder, if I recall correctly, control wire that I'd been leaning on pretty hard. He said that he'd been fairly sure that there was a control failure of some kind, and that he thought we'd possibly be landing fairly hard in a not optimal place to land. Dude was unshakable. About 15 years ago I was a passenger on a flight that started having bad turbulence. The flight attendants were serving drinks, so they locked up their carts as the pilot told them to sit down. A minute into it I realized we were also descending very rapidly. I caught a glimpse of the 2 flight attendants holding hands and I thought, wow, even they are scared, and it really unsettled me. A minute later and we were still bumping around and descending fast. Everyone starts gasping and a few people yell. Drinks are flying everywhere. I don't know why I had just assumed that if we were all about to die that the pilot would make an announcement. And then I realized that they probably wouldn't say anything to keep everyone calm. I look at the flight attendants again and they are both sobbing, holding onto each other. I was pretty sure that if they knew we were about to die, obviously we all survived, and I have no clue what was going on or if we were ever in real danger, but now I search the flight attendants' faces whenever there's any tiny bit of turbulence. Not a pilot, and late to the game here, but on the 1st of December, 1974 I was a passenger on a flight from Chicago to Washington National. The weather coming in was not good. Like other flights, we were probably routed to Dulles because National was closed due to weather. So was TWA 514, which slammed into a mountain ahead of us. That resulted in Dulles shutting down, leaving us and presumably other flights circling over Washington. Circling for a very long time. Fuel running low. We must have been the last flight cleared to land at Baltimore. We landed and the plane came to a stop at the end of the runway. The pilot came out and shook everyone's hands to applause. We deplaned right there at the end of the runway and were shuttled to the terminal. I can only guess that we landed without fuel and the plane had to be towed in. I was 5, and that's how I remember it. Ex-Navy guy. I was a front seater, navigator, in the EA-6B Prowler on an Operation New Dawn, on mission in the late stages of the Iraq withdrawal. My pilot and I had been covering extra missions for dudes on our boat who couldn't fly due to a gastrointestinal outbreak on our ship. Legit. A third of the ship's complement of 5k people was crapping itself uncontrollably since someone couldn't wash their hands before handling the corn dogs and iceberg lettuce. This is disturbingly common. We were exhausted with the uptick in tempo that came from covering their duties. It was one night when we were flying out of Iraq and back to the boat at roughly midnight. I was drifting, but doing everything I could to stay awake, talking, turning up my oxygen, and even freaking slapping myself. For some reason, I gave in. I don't know why. Then I wake up in a panic and realize our ship's sea control strike was contacting us on guard emergency channel. Embarrassed that I missed a whole other call on another channel and even more mortified that I fell asleep in front of my pilot, I rogered up and set the new nav. Then I realized the pilot was asleep too. I got on Ike's crew comms to talk to the guys in back. No answers. Likely also asleep. I patted the pilot on the leg, woke him up, pretended I didn't think he was asleep to help him save face. I fed him a Monster Energy drink and kept calling him awesome, like a good NFO does, and we brought it in for an OK3 wire. God, he was sweating like a mother, but he was one of the best, skeeziest pilots I knew. He could play off a mistake like he was adding an extra challenge to his portfolio. Definitely miss those days. So yeah, he and I knew. The guys in back were clueless, and we ate a frick ton of ice cream that night. Happy just to be alive. In January 2007 I was on the passenger manifest for a flight from Mosul, Iraq, Camp Diamond back to Tal Afar. The flight was scheduled to leave at 0100. I arrived at just after midnight and it was raining and pretty windy. About 15 minutes before the flight was supposed to leave we were told the flight was cancelled due to the weather. Since I was stationed at Diamondback I just went back to my bunk and hit the hay because I was told we would be flying out at 0600 instead. The passenger gathering point Apex was right next to the hospital and as I walked through the hospital on my way to the flight line a friend of mine came running up to me and threw her arms around my neck, hugged me and started crying. It turns out the pilots changed their mind about flying and the UH-60 Blackhawks left at 0130. The helicopter had crashed just outside Tal Afar, was still missing at that point and my name was still on the manifest. We found out a few hours later that there were no survivors of the crash. It was a spooky freaking feeling. I had to email my family and let them know if anyone showed up to notify them I had been clear that it was a mistake. I don't know if this belongs under this heading, but it's definitely the scariest flight related event of my life. T-38C instructor pilot here. For everyone who isn't familiar, all USAF pilots who fly fast pointy airplanes go through training in the T-38C. It's a pretty old jet, flown since 1970, that is notorious for being underpowered with very tiny wings. Many a pilot have died during actual TP stalls in what we call the final turn, the 180-degree turn from downwind to final that military aircraft make in a single descending, relatively tight turn. Anyways, my student is extremely close to the runway on downwind, literally half as far from the runway as he's supposed to be laterally, and because I'm relatively comfortable in the moment, I don't tell him to discontinue his approach, break out, and re-enter the pattern to try again. Definitely a foul on me, so he rolls off into his final turn, and I immediately assess that the turn is going to be too tight, and that we're going to stall. I take control and start to go around, immediately selecting maximum afterburner and pulling as tightly as possible. We're going relatively slow, so we're limited by the aircraft's AOA available, not G's. I'm pulling a maximum AOA turn trying not to overshoot the runway. This is important because we have a parallel runway that is occupied by other aircraft in their own VFO pattern. We still overshoot like big dogs, but we end up not stalling and successfully completing the turn. I deconfigure and take a few seconds to calm down. My student had absolutely no awareness of the significance of what had just occurred. Suffice to say he had quite the debrief. Helicopter pilot here. No passengers per set, but 2 pilots and an aircrewman in the back. We were at a civilian airport working their runway at nighttime on night vision goggles. On takeoff, there was a lot of chatter on our second radio, so we turned it all the way down. It was just our base and maintenance frequency, and none of it pertained to us. We were just concerned with our primary radio, ground, tower, working area frequencies. Later in the flight, as we approached the civilian airport, we changed our second radio from our base frequency to the civilian traffic frequency. It was night, so the only traffic is usually other military training flights, so we weren't too worried about other aircraft. Alas, we made all the standard calls. After about 3 laps in the pattern we stopped making calls, because we knew we were the only traffic. About 15 minutes later, as we turned onto final, we came right over top of another helicopter. I pulled in power and climbed away. We realized that we had left our radio volume down, and didn't hear the other aircraft coming in. We had taken a few laps off from making radio calls, and we were out of phase in the pattern and didn't see the other aircraft. Scared me shitless coming right over top of another helicopter's main rotors. Answering for my dad, now a 747 captain for British Airways, as he isn't on Reddit. He was SFO on a flight that had a terrorist attack attempt. A man broke into the cockpit, pulled the captain away from the controls and grabbed them, pointing the nose straight down, trying to crash the plane directly into the ground. The captain, who was a Scottish man, said in an interview, in his strong Glaswegian accent, "I could see the only way to stop him was to seriously hurt him, so I did." He stuck his dank thumbs into the eyes of the guy trying to take over the plane. He and my dad safely landed and the guy was arrested. They each got a bottle of Glenmorangie as a reward. Passenger here. When the DC-9 we were on did a 180 on the runway during landing was pretty bad. Doing 100 miles per hour going backwards down a runway I think qualifies as a "we're all fricked" moment. Hydroplaning a passenger jet is bad. The pilot stopped the plane by putting forward thrusters in. This was in the 70s. My parents got free drinks at the bar and the pilots lost their licenses. Later the runway was found to be subpar. Achievement unlocked 1000 G. Drifter jet. Not a pilot. Coming in from LAX to Dallas. Rough ride. Bad storm. The captain comes on and says we will probably have to divert, but he wants to try something and we should all buckle up for the fun of it. We dropped what felt like a couple hundred feet, and a crosswind took our left wing up. The whole plane starts screaming, and you can feel the plane moving sideways, about 50 feet from the runway, and we literally slide to the next runway over and hit the deck at full speed. Slam on the brakes, the whole plane lurches and buckles. Pilot comes on the comb. Woohoo. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dallas featuring Worth, and if you could not tell my bosses I just did that, I would appreciate it oh so very much. Please remain seated. One time during glider training, I left my water bottle in the leather boot at the base of the control stick. I didn't notice it until we were accelerating down the runway behind the tow plane. Luckily it only restricted the large movements required during the first few seconds of the takeoff run, but I could still feel it binding up until I managed to reach down and grab it after reaching a safe altitude. The instructor wasn't aware of the situation, but scolded me when he saw that I'd brought the bottle with me, saying, "Loose objects in the cockpit can be very dangerous." I didn't have the balls to tell him about it during the debrief. I was by myself, but there was a lot of people in the sailboats below me that I would have crashed into if I hadn't recovered. My dad ran the FBO at this little coastal airport. I worked for him and learned to fly on my off time. I had about 20 solo hours under my belt and was flying one gorgeous hot summer afternoon to do some touch and goes. I take off and had just passed over the power lines at the end of the runway. It's so hot that the plane is basically hanging in the air, slowly ascending in the humid soup of that scorching afternoon. Everyone who can be on the water in the harbor is desperate to find some relief. I'm checking off my list of potential hazards. Cleared the power lines. Next is the sailboat basin. then the crowded resort town until I can dogleg off to the national seashore and away from civilization. When it happens, entire firewall instrument panel falls off into my lap. The 172 had just been taken in for maintenance, and the new guy didn't screw the panel back into place. I'm strong for an 18-year-old girl and don't panic much. It still took all my strength to keep the yoke steady as I adjust to the roar and heat of the engine. With my free hand I reach out and grab the hole that the yoke protrudes out of and pull up. I managed to shimmy the panel back in place and keep it in place with my hand and knee. It does cut into my knee, but I managed to ignore it long enough to call over the radio and say I have a minor problem and need to be next to land. The airport was unmanned, but the local pilots are a congenial bunch and will radio their position if requested. So the other pilots get out of my way and let me land. Of course my dad and anyone who was on the ground and in the FBO and heard me was standing by the maintenance hangar to see what happened. They couldn't believe that I managed to not crash. Those panels are heavy metal. The new maintenance guy was already not passing muster with our regular guy, so he was fired. I was close with the main mechanic, and he was so upset that he hadn't double checked the panel. But it's an instrument panel, which should have obviously been manageable for even a trained monkey. I am forever grateful for my awesome instructors who drilled emergency preparation into me. My favorite was the elder brother of Michael J. Smith, the pilot of the Challenger, when I had to quit flying because of a heart problem. On my last flight before I went back to school, he took me barnstorming over a friend's property. He was having me set up an emergency landing on the field and told me that we were going to get down to about 50 feet. Then he slams the throttle to the wall and says surprise. We did a few more flyovers. Best flight ever. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.